Victor Purton here, and this is the Centre for Optimism. And thank you for joining us. This is going to be a fabulous evening in Australia, morning in Europe, middle of the night in the United States, middle of the day in India. And we have Heather Craig here. Heather is an absolutely brilliant optimism researcher, and she's written this brilliant paper. The title is The Association of Optimism and Pessimism and All-Cause Mortality, a Systemic Review. In short, it says if you're a realistic optimist, you'll live longer. Heather Craig, welcome.
Thank you. It's very exciting to be here.
We're excited to have you. And joining me on the panel is Amanda Noz, the leader of Professional Women's Network in the southeast of France, in Nice, Côte d'Azur. Amanda, welcome.
Thank you, Victor.
Now, as we always do at the beginning of Centre for Optimism events, we ask our panelists what makes them optimistic. So Heather Craig, what makes you optimistic?
Thank you, Victor. I think I could almost talk for an hour just on this, but to keep it short and sweet, I think that what I'm optimistic about is that in life, I think how we feel and what we do is all driven by our beliefs. And I think if we hold on to a belief that adversity is part of life, but that it's temporary, we can get ourselves through the hardest of times.
Yeah, that's absolutely brilliant. And today I was sharing with some people that, and they might be sick of me talking about her mother, Julian of Norwich. 700 years ago, she said, all shall be well, all shall be well. Ill manner of things shall be well. So I think we still mirror that today, don't we, Heather?
Absolutely.
And Amanda Noz, what makes you optimistic?
You know, I love what Heather said, because I think in a way it changed a little bit my answer, because I was going to concentrate a little bit on the here and now and saying, well, you know, what makes me optimistic is I think at the start of the year, people said, oh, great, we've got vaccinations, this is going to be over. And then it's dragged on for another 6 months and people are like, really? But the light at the end of the tunnel is coming. You know, people are getting vaccinated. There was a really good announcement from the US that they're going to share all those vaccine patents with the rest of the world for free. So lots of positive things, but that's a bit in the here and now. But in the overall scheme of things, I tend to agree with what Heather had to say. Is it's a little bit the Buddhist philosophy of all things are temporary, or you know, in vernacular terms, this too shall pass. And I think that's what makes me optimistic, is there's so much good in the world and there's so many interesting things happening. So when you sort of get stuck in something that might not be so good, you can have that perspective. You can say, well, right now this isn't good, but I know things will be better tomorrow.
Fantastic. Well, look, the first question that I'd like to ask you, Heather, coming out of your research, is can you tell us what is optimism?
Sure. So I guess in its most simple forms, and the first problem I found when I began my research is that there's actually not one accepted definition of what optimism is. But the most common theory about what optimism is that it's a belief that things that happen in the future will be positive, and that then has influences on health and behavior.
And but your research is really interesting, because most of us have grown up thinking that optimism is the opposite of pessimism, and that there's a spectrum, and your research shows something different.
Yeah, it does. So there's actually been debate amongst the world of research about whether optimism and pessimism are on a continuum, in terms of you're either very optimistic or you're very pessimistic. But there's been a lot of work done, and there was an excellent study that reanalyzed a lot of the work that had already been done. And what it's shown is that optimism and pessimism are actually distinct constructs. So a person needn't either be an optimist or a pessimist. You might be really optimistic about the fact that, hey, in Melbourne we had fabulous weather today and it just lifted everyone's spirits. But at the same time, you might be a little bit pessimistic if, like me, you burnt your dinner a little bit. So it's possible to be both. And I think that's what's come out of the studies that I've done.
And I think they even say they might even be different parts of the brain at work.
Yes, So there's some really interesting work on the neuroscience of optimism and pessimism. And a lot of it has to do with the way the brain operates with the two hemispheres. So you've got your left hemisphere and your right hemisphere. And although they work in conjunction, they both have more dominant functions. And optimism ties quite closely to the left hemisphere, which interestingly, most people are right-handed. So their left hemisphere is more dominant, which I guess is very interesting, and it leads to a lot more questions about the way the brain is involved in optimism and conversely pessimism.
Absolutely fascinating. I didn't advertise this as a masterclass, but I think everyone who's here is going to be able to go away, and when someone says, "Oh God, you're an optimist," I'm sick of it, you can actually say, well, there are incredible health benefits from doing it. And I think, as you know, the Centre for Optimism has been about realistic and infectiously optimistic leadership right from the beginning. And there was an influence from Dominic Barton, who was the head of McKinsey, who said to me, look, every great leader I've ever met is infectiously optimistic and in a realistic way. Bob Iger, who headed up Disney in his book last year on, 21st century leadership, number one was realistic optimism. But from the health perspective, you say that it's realistic optimism that makes us live longer. Do you want to tell us about that?
Sure. So the study I did, we started off with almost 7,000 papers, and we did a lot of different searches, and we narrowed it down to 25. And there was quite strong evidence that optimism was associated with lower risk of mortality, and that pessimism was also associated with increased risk of mortality. But something that came out of the research, which was a little unexpected, was that unrealistic optimism is in some terms even more harmful than pessimism. So there was one study by some researchers that found that being unrealistically optimistic, and what I mean by that is either overestimating the chances of something good happening or underestimating risk, that was associated with over 3 times the risk of mortality. So that was a really interesting paper, and it's also something that's known as the optimism bias, which is where almost like the Pollyanna, where people are just so positive that they can't acknowledge risk and the more rational arguments.
Because I think we, as you know, in January, we did an interview with the scientific panel of the American Heart Association. And they said one of the mechanisms, the optimist tends to do more exercise, tends to eat better. If the doctor tells you to take your pills, you're going to take your pills. So I think what you're saying is that the Pollyanna actually just forgets to do that stuff.
Yeah, and what I'm particularly interested in with my honours research, I actually looked at adherence to preventative medication. And something that I've been thinking about a little bit is whether perhaps those who are unrealistically optimistic may ignore preventative health measures and following preventive health regimes as well. So that's another thing I'm thinking about.
Now, so the Heart Association's view was that it's pessimism, anxiety, and depression that produces hormones, chemicals in the body that damage the body. High blood pressure damages the blood vessels, hurts the kidneys. Do you want to tell us about what does the research say about how pessimism, anxiety, and depression damages the body and how optimism is protective?
Sure. So when you look at the bigger picture, it all boils down to the thinking styles of an optimist and a pessimist. And a pessimist tends to engage in what's known as perseverative thinking, which is that rumination we all sometimes do, where we think about the things we fear or the things we're stressed about, things that have happened or that might happen. And what that does is it increases the body's level of arousal. It increases your blood pressure, it increases your cortisol, and all of that damages your internal organs, and particularly the heart, which then leads to increased risk of mortality.
So the questions are already building up, Heather. Gary Miller says, how do we become more optimistic? And you and I are exchanging some views with some Danish researchers yesterday, or today, I'm saying, yesterday, Danish time. So what are the ways that we can make ourselves more optimistic so we don't get sicker overnight?
Yeah, so I think if I can give Project Optimism a little plug here, there's a fantastic free course. It takes less than an hour to do. I've done it. It's really fun and engaging. And that teaches you the habits of an optimist. In terms of other sort of evidence-based things, there's a couple of simple but really effective exercises you can do. One that's quite well known is the best self exercise, where you predict your best self in the future and you describe it in detail and you imagine it. And there's also another one that has actually, which is really interesting, been shown to also decrease pessimism. And it was published in a paper back in 2014. And it's an online intervention. And it's quite brief. It only goes for 3 weeks. And every second day, the participants complete an activity. And on the first day, the activity they do, I'm just referring to my notes here, sorry, is that they list 5 things that make them feel like their life is enjoyable and meaningful and enriching, and 3 things that could help them see the bright side of problems. And then on the 3rd day, so 2 days later, what they reflect on is they describe a goal that they'd really like to achieve in the next couple of days and how they might go about achieving that goal. And that simple exercise over a period of 3 weeks was found to increase happiness, and it was also found to increase engagement in life. And it also, interestingly, it led to a long-term reduction in dysfunctional thinking. So it basically shifted people's attitudes, just a simple course. So there's no sort of right or wrong way to be more optimistic, but I think the easiest way is to smile. Just smile at people you see in the street. And if they don't smile back, just smile even more. So, yeah.
Well, as you know, we had that brilliant interview with that artist from Sydney who talked about walking through King's Cross, and everyone was smiling back at him, and he thought he had spaghetti on his shirt, but it was actually him smiling back at them. So the last question from me because we've already got the questions lining up, Garak and Paul and Bill and others have all got good questions and the like. There's a public policy issue. So last week I met with one of the state government ministers because they were talking about suicide prevention policy. And I talked to them about the view from Harvard University, Melbourne University, the American Heart Association, that this is now a public policy issue. If we know that pessimism is damaging people's health, we ought to be doing something about it. And your report refers to that as well. So what should governments do? I mean, the Centre for Optimism is all about people doing it for themselves and us helping them do it. But is there an argument for government intervention?
I think there certainly is. I mean, the health benefits are quite clear. And there's, as we were talking about today on LinkedIn, there was some really interesting work on what's now being called positive epidemiology, where instead of research and health policy focusing on the burden of disease, what's really exciting is recognizing health assets, which are protective factors which can help promote health. So if our government was able to advocate for promoting optimism and mental well-being, it could really make a big difference to health outcomes. And I think that in our current world, there is pessimism, and it's easy sometimes to feel hopeless, which I think is what's so closely associated with suicide. And I think if we can promote optimism, this could really help.
Yeah. So I've actually made a couple of submissions recently. So I think we're just going to, as a centre, I think we're just going to keep pushing that. So Amanda, what's your reaction to those wonderful suggestions on how to make yourself more optimistic? In the sessions you've been running in France, what were the habits of an optimist that really resonated with the French?
So in answer to the first question, I'm fascinated by the whole left brain, right brain thing, because I'm actually left-handed, not right-handed. So I was interested to hear from Heather a little bit more about that. Should we go, then I'll answer the rest of your question.
Of course, Heather.
Sure. So I was sort of alluding to that, but you can be quite what's known as not ambidextrous, but just because you've got a dominant hemisphere, it doesn't always mean that you are then left side or right side dominant, because there's in the brain, the corpus callosum is the interconnection between the communication in the brain. So although one hemisphere may be dominant with certain things, so the left hemisphere is more dominant when it comes to optimism, you may also have strengths that come from your right hemisphere. So it's quite interconnected. I hope that helps understand a little bit, but
yes, fascinating research, or you know, how it works with the brain and the body and that connection. So in answer to your second question, Victor, I think what's making people optimistic at the minute, there's two things I've noticed. One is being able to get outside again, because we've all been locked down. So everybody's super excited about simple things like, you know, can we meet up and have brunch at the beach? And, you know, can we do a hike? Or, you know, just really, you know, not expensive, exotic things, but just being able to get out and get together in groups again. I think that's what's making people optimistic. It's the people, the people interaction thing, and it's the idea that you can do it outside. And it's also been a very wet month. I think it's been the wettest, coldest month in France in record this year. So the fact that the sun's finally come back, that's also made people pretty optimistic.
Well, look, let's take, we're getting the panelists on board now, and some really good questions. I'm just trying to look for Gorak with his video, so I might come back to him when his video's on. But Paul Chapman, you have got Paul's beaming in from Bendigo, the chairman of the very optimistic Bendigo Invention and Innovation Festival. And you can see he's wearing our theme colours. Paul, what's your question?
Thanks, Victor. Well, I've got to tell you this, Victor. It's got nothing to do with your question, but I've got to address this to Amanda. You know, our little company here, Victor, our first venture into France, and our first turntable into France was on the Côte d'Azur, a little place called Mondaloo. And we've made the most beautiful friends there, and I have the opportunity every couple of years to go and visit and stay in Mondaloo, and we love it. So that's a great thing. Heather, I'm always intrigued by the press and the cynicism of the press. And I was just wondering about that correlation between cynicism and pessimism, which seem inextricably connected, and how us optimists can combat that. And get yourself into trouble trying to fix that up.
Thanks, Paul. Yeah, I agree. I think, unfortunately, bad news seems to sell stories. I mean, you can filter it out to a certain degree and be in control of the way you absorb the media. But I think it's sometimes very difficult. We're immersed in this world of pessimism and cynicism. And I think that from a personal point of view, I don't know a lot about the research into cynicism and pessimism. But what I do know is that, as Victor and Noreen and Jenny will show, optimism is infectious. So I think the best way that we as optimists can make the world a more optimistic and positive place is to spread optimism. So yeah, I hope that answers your question.
I think that's brilliantly answered. And Paul, you can come back later. But Gorak, are you online? I can't see you on video. Oh, there he is. He's sideways. Gorak. You need to come off mute, Gorak.
Yeah, I'm unmute now.
So, Gorak, you've got a couple of questions.
Yeah, my question is very simple. To the panelists and you too, Victor, which is the best moment, optimistic moment of your life, and what changes it brought in your life and the life of others, loved ones or people you know very well?
So, Heather, do you want to have a crack at that first?
Sure, that's a good one for me, actually. So when I was about 16 and a half, I was told I wouldn't finish high school. Age 17, I decided not only that I wanted to finish high school, but that I wanted to study medicine. So I worked really, really hard. And in my year 12, I studied chemistry by distance education because my school didn't teach chemistry. But to cut a very long story short, in the February or the January when they announced the uni offers, Mum and I, it was back in the day when it was published in the newspaper, and we rocked down to Frankston Station and picked up the newspaper and went back to the car and frantically looked at my number, and I'd got into medicine, and it was such an exciting moment. But to add even more excitement to it, my grandma at the time was actually in a rehabilitation hospital following a fall. And my mum, without me knowing it, had put a bottle of champagne in our car boot. So we ended up at this rehab hospital drinking champagne out of plastic hospital cups. And in comes the nurse and says, "Oh, Joyce, we've got your evening Milo here." And she raises her glass and says, "We don't need that. We've got bubbles." And I'll never forget it. Her joy and her positivity was just infectious. And I think that's where I get a lot of my optimism from. So without a doubt, that's it for me.
So, Gorak, I'm going to go back to you. What is the most optimistic moment in your life, and how did that change you?
There are many moments because I am a very positive person in life. But since I'm a frontline worker in India at present, a doctor by profession, for me, every moment today is optimistic moment, because to save a life is one of the best optimistic moments a person can go by. And we know that there is the issue of infrastructure here, the other issues here. Still, we are very hopeful we will come out of it, and very, very hopeful things will change. And there cannot be bigger optimistic moment than this for me.
That is absolutely brilliant. Yes, no, our hearts are all with you, Gorak, and we've
Thanks
been
a lot.
helping, as you know, with the Australian government's response.
Yes, yes.
People have been making private donations. So Amanda is the other full-time panelist. What's your answer to the question of your most optimistic moment?
You know, it's quite a funny story, Victor. And don't my husband will forgive me for telling this one on a recorded video.
No, I might put you on mute.
But I moved to France for 18 months about 30 years ago, and I had an exchange from the company I was working in Australia. They sent me to France for 18 months, and over that period, my husband, who I had met in Australia, moved back to France. He wasn't my husband then. We weren't even going out together, and we started, going out together. So I didn't want to come back to Australia, and I walked into the VP's office in the group I was working, and I, explained this little wrinkle, that the company had this thought that I might move back to Australia, and I had this thought that I might stay in France because I'd met this nice French boy. And I just remember he looked at me and he said, "So, Amanda, I understand very well. Either I help you stay in France or you leave the company." And I hadn't said that, but he was obviously thinking that young love was going to override any sort of career objectives. And I just looked back at him and I said, I suppose you could see it like that. And he helped me find a job in a different branch in the company in France. And I ended up staying in France for a while. And then we moved to America, and my life just was completely different.
Oh, Gorak, you've started everyone. I think everyone's thinking of their most romantic moments as that wonderful question. I think, Gorak, if I've got a very good doctor here in Melbourne, but I think you are going to have to be my specialist in whatever field I need you in. That was brilliant. Now, you've got a second question, which is really good because it was asked of me the other day at a meeting, and it's about hope and optimism. And Heather, it's quite a lot of theology, the Catholics and the Orthodox and versus the Protestants and the Sikhs and the like. So, Gaurav, do you want to raise that point on the difference between hope and optimism? Gaurav can't hear me. So, Heather, do you want to talk to it? What's the difference between hope and optimism, and what's the difference in value?
Yeah, sure. So it's very easy to think that hope and optimism are one and the same thing. And often when we say we're hopeful about something, we mean that we're optimistic. And I suppose the key difference is that optimism relates to a sense of confidence in future expectations, whereas hope is more an emotional feeling. We may be hopeful, but we may not be confident in a positive expectation. And that's the key difference that I've found in the literature so far. But it certainly, there's a blurred line there between hope and optimism. So it's something that I'm still reading up on and still getting my head around, but it's really that sense of confidence, and that confidence that an optimist has is then what influences their actions, because if they've got a goal, they're more likely to invest in the goal because they're confident that their actions will lead to a positive outcome.
And if anyone's got an interest in this, I was at an event the other day, a Ramadan event, and there was an Anglican bishop. And I said that I work in optimism. And she sort of looked at me and immediately had that view that hope is better than optimism. And if you look at our literature on the website, you'll see, for instance, the current Pope is very much a hope versus optimism person. But when he makes speeches in Asia, he's actually pro-optimism. But the previous Pope Benedict, there's actually this brilliant sermon on our page on Mother Julian of Norwich. And he was obviously a big fan of optimism as well as hope. So really interesting. We might actually do a session on that one day. I think that'll be interesting. Now, Bill, you two are wearing team colours. What's your question for Heather?
Well, yes, I'm wearing my Optimist prayer shawl. And I think the question that I have centers around, well, first of all, I just want to identify Indiana, where I am calling from, as the corpus callosum of the United States, because we bring the North, the South, the East, and the West together in the center, you see. So this is a happy coincidence and gives us a status where we can find some peace between the Atlantic peoples and the Pacific peoples of the United States and North America in general. But there's an issue that I'm concerned about that I want to find ways and ask for your help in developing tools to overcome. And that is this notion of a vaccine passport. There are going to be a number of things. There are already 700 colleges and universities who will require vaccination to attend this fall, this coming fall. And I think that number will keep growing if everything I'm reading is right. The other thing that's happening is that it seems to me that our human nature is to separate, is to find ways to either create a hierarchy or separation between haves and have-nots on this vaccination thing. And so let me just bounce these two phrases off you. The number one, the optimist who is well informed and vaccinated can go forth bravely, believing the science, providing a model for those surrounding him or her. Statement number two is, with such an optimistic faith, variants also demand a strategy. One needs to be ready to get the booster shots, which are now inevitable for these variants that are coming along, that are not covered by the original Moderna, Pfizer, J&J, etc. I'm just throwing this out for discussion because I'm looking for help in dealing with natural feelings of wanting to stay away from people who say they're not going to get the shots.
Yeah, they're huge questions, really. I feel incredibly unqualified to comment on them, but they're great questions. And I think having faith and believing in science, it's important, but at the same time, we need to respect people's rights. And I think that any form of medical intervention is a choice. And I think that, yes, I will get vaccinated for sure, but I think it's a personal decision. And I think it gets really tricky when things like a vaccine passport may become mandated, whether it be for a work situation or a college education, as is the case. I think it's very tricky ethical territory, and I would feel unqualified to comment on it, but I think it identifies a huge debate, really, as to how do we balance our optimism and our own beliefs and our own faith with that of other people. So I think they're such great questions, and I'd love to see what the other panelists and the people here think too. Thank you.
They're great questions, Bill, and I think we might come back to it in our broader discussion. Yeah, I think there's some really strong writing I shared on the website the other day about the role of agency in optimism. You know, that personal freedom and personal decision making has a strong impact on our optimism. But I think we'll come back to that in the general discussion, because Les Peckett's got a different question around education levels and income and the impact that has on optimism. Les?
Yeah, Heather, in your notes that I have downloaded and looked at, it talked about the fact that low education income levels have a negative impact. Yet there are many studies around on happiness that says neither education nor income seem to impact the level of happiness. And we find that many people in the poorest countries and the least educated among the world's happiness. And I'm a great believer that optimism is a major contributor to happiness. Yes. Interested in your response.
Sure, great question, Les. And it's interesting. And I think perhaps the key point here is that in my literature review, so the paper I published, that included all of the current literature on the evidence for the association between optimism and/or pessimism and mortality. But the limitation was that the research came from high-income countries. So whilst in areas that we've studied, which tend to be high-income countries, things like more education and higher socioeconomic status are related to higher optimism, there's a big gap in the literature as to developing countries. And I think that moving forward, it would be great if more research could be done in these groups so that there was a better global picture. So I hope that answers your question, because I think that there's also a big correlation between optimism and happiness, definitely. And one paper I hope to do in future is how closely those two things are in fact related. So
that'd be a good study.
Yeah. Well, I've got the data set I'm working with at the moment is of almost 20,000 people, older people. And there's data there for optimism as well as happiness. So hopefully I'll get some time in the future to work on that paper.
Good luck.
And we're hoping to get Pamela Graham from the Brookings Institute to join us at some point. She's done two really interesting studies, Les, one on poor communities in Peru and the Black community of North America. And what's really interesting is that their optimism is higher than the general population. And the theory is they've got more spirituality, they sing together, they have bigger families. In the US, you've got the problem that a lot of the men go to jail. But even if that happens, you've got strong mother and grandmother figures. So that even when they've gone to college and moved to New York or elsewhere, they will often come back on the weekend to go to church with mum or grandmum. And so there's some really, I think, Les, we'll try and bring back some more work on that, because I know Rob Masters, our chairman, is really fascinated with this question around happiness and optimism, and particularly the interventions of the Arabic states on ministers for happiness and the like, and, you know, billboards all around the place saying, smile, and reminding people to smile. Now, Gary, you've got a really interesting Nirvana question, not the rock group, but a good question on Nirvana in optimism.
Yeah, no, it's no, thank you. Good evening and good morning and afternoon, I suppose, to people that are around. No, I found it fascinating, Heather, in particular, the approach that you're taking to try and understand optimism, because as Victor knows, I'm a long-termer in design, and I know Paul actually, and it was a few years ago that I was there with a quip, Paul, you probably remember, and enjoyed your company in Bendigo. And you know, the work that I've been involved with has largely been around you know, how I can sort of provide the catalyst for businesses and organizations to be more design orientated, because I am optimistic, but I also do battle with degrees of pessimism, because it's the nature of my work, and people tend to involve those that are seen to be exotic and offering something different, you know, when they've tried everything else. And you know, you're often dealing with a problem, you know, which is sort of outlaid. So my sort of question was around, you know, whether we should even be trying to assist people to be anything than what they are. And I go back to when I was an industrial design graduate at Manchester Polytechnic in the 80s, when my friends, my peers, and we used to take positions around what we thought was good design, and anything that was particularly visual. So I had a friend who I fell out with, in fact, because he liked Porsche 911s, and, you know, I like Ferraris, you know, I mean, I had to choose something different, you know. And Andrew and I, we really sort of hit heads. And it wasn't till, you know, I became a bit more mature about it, and I suppose Andrew did, and a few others sort of said things, that, you know, we were wrong in those days, in that, you know, we should have recognized that there were many forms of that's just right. And, you know, our job perhaps was to, you know, at one level promote things that were better, but we should never have taken positions around what we thought people should do. And, you know, I mean, just a further, sorry, Victor, but a further sort of dynamic to this is that I worked with a very large superannuation company a couple of years ago, and they were very successful. In fact, they are the most successful superannuation firms in the country, and they have 200, 300, 400 business analysts. And they know that when people do things themselves, they do DIY investments, it usually fails miserably. So, you know, the whole conversation was around, do we allow people to do DIY? Yes, no. To what degree? When do we intervene, if at all? You know, to protect this notion that, you know, we stand for something. So, you know, to go back to the question, you know, is there a nirvana for optimism? You know, should we be intervening? Should we be trying to recognize what the shift is that we perhaps are working on at a high level, which may or may not be reducing the frequency of swings from negative to positive, and, you know, making those troughs safer environments for people to become more optimistic, to the point where they can then really sort of, you know, be very conscious and unconscious about their optimistic state.
Very interesting question. Thank you, Gary. And it's interesting. It's interesting hearing your background and your experiences too. So thank you. I think what I take from what you're speaking of is leadership, and I think so much of human development is about modeling. It's what parents do with their children and what our mentors do for us. And I think that one of the key roles of optimism and spreading optimism is through optimistic leaders. And I think like any form of influence, we can't change people, and we can't necessarily shift whether they're an optimist or a pessimist. But if I'm understanding what you're saying, what I think we do is we demonstrate that optimism is associated with better health, and as Les mentioned, it's associated with happiness and overall well-being. And I think if we model that, and if our governments can lead in that way, I think that the world can become, I think the world is a positive place. I mean, I'm an optimist. I think overall that we live in a wonderful time on a wonderful planet, but I think we can make it even better if we model optimism and if our leaders can really espouse optimism too. So I hope that.
No, thanks, Heather. I mean, I've been intrigued recently. I'll sort of let others ask questions and give it the reins back to you, Victor. But I've been interested recently in some jobs which have been created, and you know, people that I don't really know, but I can sort of associate with what they're doing, and they are chief optimists. And you know, I'm sort of very mindful of 2 or 3 years ago, businesses started having chief design officers, and many of these design officers, they probably weren't, you know, I mean, anyway, it doesn't matter what their qualifications were or anything, but I was quite skeptical about whether or not they would be able to get traction. And 12 months into, you know, this sort of trend, I started reading things about, you know, businesses, they didn't know what, that it was unsuccessful, that engagement. They didn't get what their expectations were. You know, there was perhaps poorly set expectations on the side of the leadership, and they didn't know why they wanted one of the, they thought it was a good idea, but the people that were taking these positions, obviously they were fortunate enough to get them in the first place, but they seemed to fail to get the traction necessary to survive and to grow and prosper within these very corporate environments where they were considered to be exotic, and they're very on their own. So I think that, I mean, obviously, you know, I think there's over back to you, Victor, because I
can I respond? Because I gave a briefing to a very senior government official the other day, and she said, Centre for Optimism, you don't think it sounds too new age? So I'd never really thought of myself as a new age person. As you know, I meditate and do yoga, but I'd never thought of myself as new age. So, but I reckon, Gary, there's a paper for us on the Chief Optimism Officer as the new trend. Now, Bobby Redmond has joined us, and Heather, Bobby's a psych as well. So Bob, you had a good question in relation to realistic and unrealistic optimism.
Yeah, thanks, Victor, and thanks, Heather. I'm really interested in everything you've got to say. I was particularly interested in the bit that you were saying in regards to the unrealistic optimism being a bigger risk than pessimism in actual fact, which I found quite interesting because, you know, if you look at, when you're comparing it to happiness, if you look at the studies that talk about, you know, if you do a fake smile in the mirror, you can produce endorphins to make yourself feel better or happy. But it clearly doesn't work in the same way with optimism. So there's definitely, you know, although it's associated, there's a difference there. I'm heavily involved with disability and terminal illness. And we talk constantly about living well with these conditions. And people have this thing, you know, that you can't be optimistic if there's not going to be a good end result. Yet I see myself as a realistic optimist, not a Pollyanna. You kind of know the end, but you can still live well, as we talk about it, live well with the condition. So yeah, I just find that whole thing fascinating as to whether or not maybe the unrealistic optimism could be related to denial, and so have that negative impact on the total well-being and drag your health down in the same way as denial would. Whereas realistic optimism is about finding the best in what's around, really and truly. Does that make sense?
It does, Bobby. I think I understand what you're getting at, and it's a really interesting point that as yet is still quite under-researched, is the unrealistic optimism. From my own understanding and reading, what I can see is the main difference is that evidence and the fact that if somebody has a terminal diagnosis and understands that they're on their last, however long they may have here, if they understand that but approach it with a sense of, what's the right word for it? If they understand the truth of what's going to happen, that's a different thing than blindly stumbling through, fighting for a cure and not accepting that truth. I think that's really what stood out to me there was only 2 papers actually from the 7,000 that we first found that were on unrealistic optimism. So it's certainly an area that needs more work. But as I mentioned, it's actually in some ways more harmful. And I think you raise an excellent point about denial, because I think denying the risks involved in certain activities or denying the truth, I think that would have very harmful health effects.
Yeah, thanks, Heather. Appreciate that.
No worries. Pleasure.
Now, coming late to the panel, Rob Masters, I know you've got a lot of wisdom around what's happening in the world of communicating happiness. And we were talking about that earlier. Do you've got a question to raise or a comment to make on what Heather said?
I would just like to ask Heather, where do you see us actually positioning policymakers to actually bring a greater sense of optimism to the policies that they're actually putting forward for a nation and for people to follow? Because many of the policies are high at a very high level, but they do not encourage greater optimism from the community as a whole. So how do we actually move into that type of thinking with these policymakers? And as Victor said, I'm very familiar with the Singapore and the Middle East, as in Dubai, centres for, or departments actually, for happiness, and very encouraged the way they actually go about changing society into their thinking as far as a happy society is concerned.
Huge question. And I must admit that my background isn't so much in the policy side of things. And it's something I'd certainly welcome discussion on. I think that what the Centre for Optimism is doing, and other organisations and Project Optimism and associated groups, I think that by raising awareness of optimism and maybe teaching in schools about happiness and well-being and optimism right from a very early age, I think we can gradually shift towards a more optimistic world and a more optimistic Australia. I think that it's certainly something, as Victor mentioned, there was a wonderful paper that's just come out very recently showing that mental well-being is closely associated. And if we can all work together to demonstrate that evidence, I think it's very hard to argue with. I think that evidence can go a long way to supporting what we know to be true. So I hope, from a not very familiar background in terms of policy, I hope that can help a little bit with opening further discussion. Sorry.
And Noreen, you may have heard the shout out from Heather very early up about Project Optimism and the habits of an optimist. And you know that before Christmas, I did an event for the British government, which included people from 10 Downing Street through to the Scottish and Welsh governments. And we actually had a deputy minister come back and say that the happiest hour he spent during lockdown was doing the habits of an optimist course. So Noreen, do you want to respond to what Heather has said and what you found to be the most effective new habits that help people to be more optimistic?
Heather, I've been really enjoying this. I've been listening to most of it. I was out wandering around. That's why I wasn't able to jump on sooner. But I've really been enjoying this. I just put a comment in that I feel like I've learned a lot more about optimism. I think we need to talk, actually. I love your take on different things. Yeah, the habits, for us, that's like the how. People want to be more optimistic. How can you be? Yes, it's a state of mind, it's a choice. But you need help along the way. You need to be able to practice like anything else to get better at it. So that's where the habits kind of come in. As you know, anyone who's heard me talk before, I'm not a natural optimist. I'm a learned optimist. So I'm very much a believer in optimism as a choice and learning optimism. I'm sort of reflective of a couple of points you've made, and I saw some really interesting comments as well just in the chat that have really made me think a lot more about my sense of optimism. Hope and optimism, Heather. I'm going to have to challenge you on this a little bit. This is
okay.
this kind of like, it may be a little bit like, oh my God, but I kind of agree. And yet I sort of think, is it still okay to be hopeful and think it's a part of optimism? I sort of feel like, for me, I don't think that it's full-blown optimism, but I sort of feel it's what you can feel when you can't feel anything else, and you can't even be optimistic. So I sort of say hope is like a little sister, little brother of optimism. But it's certainly the road to optimism. And yes, optimism is stronger. But does that make sense?
It does. And I think always be hopeful, always have hope. And I guess the way I like to think about it is they complement one another. So sometimes you might be really confident that something's going to go well and not that hopeful, but you're kind of confident. Other times you might be super confident. I think I just said that, sorry. If you're really hopeful, but you're not quite confident. And I think they complement one another, as you say, little sister, big sister, that sort of association.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
Perfect. Sisters, is there a song, Sisters Aren't Doing It? Now, last question, because we're reaching the 55-minute mark. But as we reach the 60-minute mark, we'll go to Wild Mark if you've still got some time, Heather. But Magda has a very interesting last question to share with us. Magda.
I might be throwing a cat in among the pigeons here, but we had a lot of discussion about realistic optimism. I wondered if there can be such a thing as realistic pessimism, if someone would like to comment on that.
Yeah, I'm happy to have a little go at that. Yeah, thanks, Magda. I think that we can all have degrees of relative pessimism as such, and it's sometimes, and that's what the evidence is too, it's sometimes almost protective. There's something called defensive pessimism, where we consider risk and it's protective. And there's actually, I can't remember who published the paper, but there was actually quite a recent paper about defensive pessimism and its associated effects. So it's something, I think the exciting thing about this field is it's increasing in terms of interest and research. And it can be, I'm sure Victor and Noreen and Jenny can relate to this, but it can be really hard to keep up with all the papers coming out. But at the same time, it's a great privilege to be a part of it. So I think it's defensive pessimism, and it's something that I hope to read more on. So
sounds interesting.
Yeah.
It's a great question. So look, what we'll do, we are at the 56-minute mark. So what I want to do is go round the panel with a last sentence, a conclusion, a message, something joyous. And then Heather, I'm going to ask you to close off, and Rob Masters for you to do the formal thank you. So Garak, everyone unmute. Garak, what's your final sentence to us?
I feel if optimism is a plant, hope is a fragrance in that.
Oh, that is, you are a poet.
Brilliant.
You are a poet. Magda, your last sentence.
Oh dear. Can you come back to me? I haven't thought of one.
Okay, Noreen, unmute. Bobby, what's your final message?
I'm a bit like Magda. Can you come back to me? I'm thinking. I'm a slow thinker now.
Okay, Gary, you unmute too. Noreen, what's your final message?
Well, I'm going to quote the Dalai Lama when in doubt. I'm going to say, choose optimism because it will always feel better.
Such wisdom, such wisdom. Gary, your final message.
Well, we often, as humans, look for starting points, and I'd like to emphasize the fact that I know a few people on this call. I know Paul Chapman, I've had meetings with him, worked with him. I know you, Victor. And I think we don't need to look for a starting point. We've already found it. So I think through you, Victor, and the Centre of Optimism, we have a very good starting point. And I think there's huge value to be drawn from sticking together because, you know, we are exotic and we need to be mainstream.
Perfect. That is a brilliant statement. Les?
Yeah, I've lost you on my screen. Can you hear me?
I'm here, yep.
Yep, okay. Well, I think an easy one. The sun will come up in the morning. It will be a beautiful day.
Melbourne in autumn, Les. Melbourne in autumn. Bill?
I'd say trust the science, be an agent in your own history by modeling behaviors that help reduce infections, you know, the old mask hand washing and do not hug triangle. But the main thing is to be confident and step forward that between hope and wonder, there is research and development, and trust the science and be creative, be a human being, and accept people who are rejecting the vaccine and accept them as people who are trying to live out this notion of this too shall pass, that which is a good survival strategy sometimes. But I would argue that the science needs to be our friend and be a source of optimism as we go forward.
We've already had a suggestion that we should ask Heather to be the chief scientist of the centre, but we'll come back to that.
Excellent
Paul
idea.
Chapman, what's your final sentence?
Victor Purton is a bloody champion. But ask Bill to add the letters IGO to that painting behind him on the wall.
Oh, fill us in.
Have a look at Bill.
What are you asking? Are you asking about my background?
I'm looking at that painting on the wall, BEND. Add the letters IGO.
So for those who live in exotic places, Bill's got Bend, Paul lives in Bendigo, RGO works. Amanda, from Pat from France, what's your conclusion?
I think that I love Magda's question about can we have realistic pessimism? And my answer to that would have been, there's always things in life that can make us pessimistic, but there's always things in life that we can be optimistic about. So focus on the positive.
Fantastic. So I've got to pop back. Two people I've got to pop back to. Magda and Bobby. Bobby, are you ready for your farewell sentence?
Yeah, in relation to today, hope, happiness and optimism may not be the same thing, but it's the right pathway anyway, because it's going to make us smile.
Brilliant. Magda.
I'd like to quote a very optimistic friend of mine, and no matter how good things get, he always says it can only get better. And
there's an old Soviet joke where one citizen says to the other, things can't get any worse, and the optimist says it can. Heather, what message are you going to leave your admirers with?
Oh, I've just had such a brilliant time. So I want to thank everyone. It's lovely being surrounded by fellow optimists and sharing what's only the beginning of a huge world of research, and it can only get better, as has been said here. But I also have a little addition for the habits of an optimist. It's going to be called Dance Like an Optimist. I discovered this a few times this week, did a little boogie in the bedroom or the bathroom or the lounge room. Is an excellent way to feel more optimistic. So be optimistic, spread optimism, and you'll feel better and you'll live longer.
Well, I often dance to Farrell's Be Happy.
Yep.
So we might throw that into the mix. Anyone who doesn't know it, Google Be Happy by Farrell, and there's a big bloke on there dancing. It looks a bit like me, and it's very, very funny. Robert Masters, can I throw to you to thank everyone and conclude the formal proceedings before we go to Wild Mike?
Thanks very much, Victor. And thank you very much, Heather, for everything you've contributed to tonight and all your work in this area. As I always say with Victor, and that optimism is contagious, and the more we can spread it, the better the world will be. And the work that you're doing, the more you can do in this area to change society is the way we want to go. So that's the formal part of it, but I'd just like to thank everyone else for participating in this evening and their contributions to it. So thank you very much. All the best.
Well, we hope you enjoyed that episode as much as we did, and we'd love to have you involved with the Centre for Optimism and the brilliant people like Heather Craig and the other panellists and participants in this wonderful episode. So go to the centreforoptimism.com. You can sign up for free for the news and alerts, or you can sign up for a full membership and support the work we're doing. Trust you have a great day and be optimistic.